Good afternoon. We're here today interviewing Tanya Cabala. We're at Whitehall, City Hall in Whitehall, Michigan. The date is May 28, 2013. My name is Debbie Hayes, and my relationship with Tanya is that we are friends and colleagues, and I respect her probably more than any other woman that I've met in this area. Also working today is Oscar Osbo, is our videographer. This interview is being conducted for the White Lake Environmental History Project. Tanya, did you agree to sign the interview release form?
Yes, I did.
Thank you very much. Before we begin, I would like to say that Tanya is considered one of West Michigan's best known and most influential environmentalists. Tanya has been involved in environmental issues in the White Lake area for more than 20 years. Tanya, tell us where you live right now and where you have lived in the past.
Well, I just want to thank Deb for doing this interview and mention that I think she's pretty biased, but that's okay. I have lived in the White Lake area all my life. I've lived in the city of Whitehall all of my life, probably except for 2 years when I was an adult and I lived in Muskegon. I live in the house, the second house that we moved to as a child, and I live in that house right now.
Does your family have roots in the White Lake area?
Well, my dad is from the Muskegon area. He was from Muskegon Heights. He was a famous athlete and went into the Navy and ended up going to a college in New Orleans, Louisiana, because a friend of his went there. He went there on the GI Bill, and waiting in line for registration, he met my mother, who grew up in New Orleans, and they got married, and she came here, and she said one of the coldest summers she thinks Michigan ever had. It was very cold for that poor southern girl. So, and they lived in the Whitehall area all that time. They were both teachers.
As a lifelong resident, what is your earliest memory of White Lake?
Well, actually, the first house that we lived in was a little cottage on Collier Drive. So we had lake property divided by Lake Street, a little bitty cottage, and I just remember always seeing the lake out our picture window. Certainly we were not allowed down there as little children, but it was a part of my earliest childhood, always in the background. And, you know, as we got older, we would run off the dock. We would try to run off and jump really far so we could get away from the weeds. We did not want to end up in the weeds. And my father was a big fisherman, loved the lake. We all loved the water. And, you know, it was always kind of a big part of my life starting back then.
Did you ever think back then that the water might not be just perfectly pure for you to play and swim in?
Oh, I don't think any of those thoughts entered my mind at that age, or probably other people. I remember taking swimming lessons, maybe through the Rotary across the lake at Maple Beach, and remember that the lake was absolutely pea green with algae. But I don't remember anybody ever being concerned about it. It just certainly wasn't a fun experience. And I was a real quiet, introverted child, so, you know, I wasn't a huge outdoor girl, you know, except for I did the usual things that kids did, you know, ride around town on your bike and take walks. But often you would find me off in a corner with a book. I was someone who was kind of off by myself a lot as a child.
At what point did you become aware that White Lake had pollution problems, and how did you become aware of it?
Well, I do remember probably when my two kids were fairly young, probably not, you know, more than 5, both of them, and I remember reading articles in the paper, kind of going back and forth on the question of whether or not we should eat fish from the lake. And considering the fact that my dad was an avid fisherman, I remember thinking about it and wondering why, why the back and forth. But I was a busy young mother, and didn't explore the issue much farther.
Do you remember in the paper who brought up the fact that the fish might not be good to eat?
Well, I remember it was the Department of Natural Resources, the DNR. That was the agency that was named in the articles, but I really didn't have any knowledge of environmental issues, environmental agencies. I graduated from high school in 1977, and the big hooker chemical furor was in the late 70s, and I'm surprised to think back that was not a topic of conversation for my family. Both my mom and dad were teachers. We read the newspaper, and we paid attention to issues, so I can't really speak to why we didn't pay attention to that issue.
What was the catalyst then that really got you going on the environmental issues and pollution in White Lake?
Well, I certainly always cared about White Lake and the White Lake area, and as an adult, continued to live in the White Lake area. And my mother also was always talking about the beauty of the lake in the area and how lucky we were. And as you get older, you start realizing that that's really true, that we're very fortunate to live here. It was after I had kids and I was starting to use paper plates and plastic cups and plastic diapers. This is embarrassing to admit, but I started wondering where all the garbage that I was creating with my new family, where it was going. I put it out on the curb and, saw the garbage truck take it away, and, it dawned on me that I had never thought about where it was going. So I started thinking, maybe that's something I should know more about, and I had heard rumors that we were going to have a recycling center or something in the White Lake area, and I, of course, was still a big book reader and often would go to the library, and the staff knew me well, and they, I would ask them, what have you heard about the recycling center? And one day they said to me, there's a lady who always talks about environmental issues like you, Tanya, and we think you two should talk together. And that was Margie Hampel, and she and I sat down, and we thought kind of naively and innocently, well, we should start an environmental group. We didn't have a clue what that meant. And so that's really, it was quite by accident, but probably not.
And what year was that, and what was the group called, and is it still in existence today?
Well, that was 1989. And I had a girlfriend that was working with me. She no longer lives in the area, and so we thought, okay, we both had 2 young children, and as much as we loved being mothers, I think we were feeling a little intellectually limited, and so we thought, okay, let's start this environmental group, and we started kind of looking into issues, and we invited Wint Dahlstrom to sit down with us, Margie Hampel, and my girlfriend and I, and at first we were quite taken aback by him, and we thought, wow, pretty high-powered and hot-tempered. And he said, what are you doing about the landfill? The landfill is expanding. And so we just quickly jumped into the issue of the landfill in Whitehall Township expanding. And I found myself, my girlfriend and I found ourselves up in front of a couple hundred people who were upset about it. We were demonstrating, we were giving interviews to the media. I, would be demonstrating with my daughter in a backpack or a front pack, and we became very interested in the issues. Wint was our mentor, we talked to him every day, and he provided us with information to learn from, and that was the beginning of a group called Concerned Citizens of White Lake.
Did you have backing of the city?
Well, it was not from a governmental standpoint, it was not a popular issue. We went to different governmental units, and they basically said, we don't have any authority over Whitehall Township. We need the landfill. We need a place for our garbage to go. What do you all think you're doing? We need a place for our garbage. And what's interesting is, several years later, when I was reading the law, I realized that, we did not really have a leg to stand on. The law was written such that if a landfill had already been permitted and wanted to expand, if it met certain criteria, it was pretty much a done deal. Of course, I didn't know that then, and I kind of wonder if Wint knew it. But regardless, it got everybody passionate and involved. And from there, I started kind of awakening to the other issues in the community, finding out that we actually had places that were polluted. And that was really quite upsetting for a while, because you live in a place and you realize that it's different than what you thought, you know, and certainly when you realize it's polluted, it's kind of it's not a good feeling. It's you feel you feel different about where you live.
Did the Concerned Citizens Group also wrap their arms around these other pollution issues that you came up with?
Well, what happened is, what often happens with groups is, there came a time when my girlfriend and I kind of had a different approach than Wint. And so two groups were formed, and that, like I said, that often happens. We had kind of started to push for recycling, and Wint's group started focusing a little bit more on the recycling issue. We continued to pursue the landfill issue through the County Solid Waste Planning Commission, which was a fairly bureaucratic, time-consuming, kind of boring issue for many people. So what happened is we had several hundred people when they thought that we had a chance to fight and stop the expansion of the landfill. And when that kind of changed and we ended up more looking at the issue from a policy perspective, the group was a lot smaller and it was split. There was Wint and Betty's group and our group. And but still, there were a number of us who were fairly obsessive with it, and I ended up, I called all kinds of groups and asked them for help. That's just what you do when you're starting out as a local group. And I was very happy that one group based in Chicago was very helpful. It was called the Lake Michigan Federation. They'd been around since 1970. And they let us know that actually White Lake and Muskegon Lake were Great Lakes areas of concern because of pollution issues, and that there'd been a cleanup plan written, and that was news to me. I thought, wow, you would think that I would know that.
And what year would this have been about?
This was still 1989-90, and the cleanup plan we found had been written in 1987. But we didn't know that we'd been on this international list of Great Lakes areas of concern. And so we kind of, my girlfriend kind of dropped out, and the group kept getting a little smaller, but we worked on several issues. I know Coke Chemical at one point wanted to expand, and we kind of pushed back against that successfully. And I was what you would call an obsessive volunteer, making phone calls, finding things out, and the Lake Michigan Federation offered to hire me. They said, would you like to come to work for us and open an office, our Michigan office. They had headquarters in Chicago, several offices in Wisconsin, and nothing in Michigan. So, as someone who had trained to be an elementary teacher, had taught for 3 years, this was a whole new way of life for me.
Did you have any staff to help you out in the early days?
Well, it was a small start. I had a little bitty office in the Frohenthal building, just a little bitty walk-in. I was the only person. It took a year for the group to get money to hire me. And I remember a lot of people saying, oh, it's not going to happen, Tanya. And, I just kind of hung in there. And after a year, they pulled together the grant funds to hire me. So I had a little office. Somebody trucked up an ancient computer that I was never able to access the internet with, but I was able to word process. And I begged them to get me a fax machine, because that was the state of the technology. People would call and say, I'd like to fax this to you. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't have a fax. So it's kind of interesting to think back that, the technology was quite a bit different. It was a lot slower. We actually used mail, the mail system. And you know, it was very exciting. I learned everything by doing it. And, but it was very challenging to be a one-person office because people expected you to do a lot more than you could. And after some time, I kind of fussed about it to my headquarters and said, you know, when am I going to get some staff? And they said, when you learn how to write grants. And if you want to keep that office open for you, you're going to have to learn how to write grants. So I learned how to write grants very quickly. And over time, ended up with an office that had 5 people in it.
So those early frustrations really were a blessing in disguise because it gave you these other talents that you now have and use on a regular basis that you might not have learned otherwise.
Well, it was a learning experience, and I firmly believe in not having everything handed to you because, the experience of learning and the motivation for learning. My motivation was I wanted to keep my job. I wanted to keep doing what I was doing, and so it was a lot of work.
What was accomplished from that time?
Well, a lot of things initially were really just putting out viewpoints and opinions. So I might show up at meetings and offer testimony or, raise issues at a meeting on a contaminated site. Because at that time, I was focused on more than White Lake. I was focused on, Lake Michigan and in particular the Muskegon area in West Michigan. So I would show up at a meeting on, a site of contamination in Muskegon and ask questions and raise some issues, and worked with people in the Muskegon area. There were some good people. Worked on a project with industries, several industries, and we were looking at reducing waste. A lot of public education programs, and one major focus was Muskegon Lake and White Lake. When I, before I even started working for the Lake Michigan Federation, representatives of that group and Great Lakes United, we went to the state of Michigan and said, hey, state of Michigan has 14 of these Great Lakes areas of concern out of a total of 43, and, what are you doing about them? So the state of Michigan held a conference and talked about, the issues, Kalamazoo River, Clinton River, some in the UP, Detroit River. And the recommendation from that citizens conference was to set up an advisory group to advise the state on how to do a better job. And to their credit, they did. They set up what's called the Michigan Statewide Public Advisory Council. And there would be one representative from each of the 14 areas of concern, and then one alternate, and the group would meet quarterly. And I was a founding member of that group. And it was very, very, very useful. It started a little awkwardly just because not everybody was sure what we could do, as a group. But, the focus was on seeing what was happening in other areas of concern, making sure that there was adequate public involvement, and even getting funds to the areas. And one of our main goals was making sure that if people in the areas of concern wanted to be involved, that they could. So there were grant funds available, and through the Lake Michigan Federation, I applied for a grant to set up an advisory council for Muskegon Lake and White Lake, because the state had not done that. The state had refused to do that, saying that both the lakes were not really a priority. And why set up a public body when they weren't really going to be putting a lot of time and effort into it, because not that much was needed in their opinion. Well, we said, how about if we do it? So when I got the grant, we set up a countywide advisory committee that solicited membership for the 2 lakes. So it wasn't me picking people. It was a countywide committee comprised of, people from government and different groups. And then we set that up, so it was kind of a representative group, people from business and industry, education, environmentalists. And then for a year or two, my office provided the meeting assistance for those groups. So we, arranged for the meetings, did the minutes and things like that. And what was kind of neat about this was the state saw it and thought, okay, So they hired a group to come in and rewrite the original cleanup plans that had been written in '87. And so then we were able to work very closely with that group and rewrite the plans in a way that it was very thorough, very comprehensive, and we all had input.
What year would that have been?
Those plans were completed in 1995.
Did that newer plan differ?
Oh,
considerably?
absolutely. Quite a bit different. I mean, when you have more people involved in it who are more knowledgeable about the area, and a lot of things came out of that. For example, the tannery had been an issue, if you look at some of the interviews in the 60s, and it kind of went a little more low-key when Hooker Chemical came out as an issue, and then it didn't really pop back up again. And one of the reasons it did come to the attention is when we were doing these cleanup plans, we were checking with the state agencies, all the different divisions, and checking on the sites and seeing the status of the information. Well, we found out that the state was going to recommend tannery to be a federal Superfund site, which was a big deal. That means it's kind of not, it's a pretty seriously contaminated site. And so that was in the cleanup plan, all that information. And I remember calling Muskegon Chronicle reporter Jeff Alexander, and I said, well, I want you to come, to our meeting where we released the new cleanup plan on White Lake. And, as a reporter, he says, okay, so tell me why I should come, Tanya. And I said, well, we have two things in particular. We have more of a focus on loss of habitat in the plan, because that had not been in the original. That's more of an issue that needs attention. And the tannery is being recommended as a federal Superfund site. It's a big deal. So Jeff, and this is when we had investigative journalism. Jeff Alexander did just a ton of research, went to Lansing, looked in all the files, did a huge story on the tannery, way more work than someone like me or someone on the public advisory group could have done. So it shows the value of a good reporter. And the Chronicle, unfortunately, published the story on July 4th, 1995, and to cries from the area that this was, the Chronicle always does that. And, I know that it wasn't intentional. They were just waiting until they had space. But it just probably didn't hurt, because it hit like a lead balloon. People were infuriated. And it was a big issue all of a sudden. State and federal officials were being besieged by people saying, what's happening. And so that's one good outcome of the rewrite of this cleanup plan, is that the tannery ended up in the public eye again, and it started some real progress.
Was the tannery long closed before that?
Oh, no. No, I don't think the tannery was still open.
Okay.
The tannery didn't close, I believe, until maybe 2002.
So it was an issue of it would be affecting people's jobs, and that perhaps is what was riling them up as well?
Well, I do understand that there's always going to be the issue of jobs, and people are going to worry. Hooker closed, but Hooker did not close because of the pollution. That was a decision they made. And, you have to question, did they close because they were under the spotlight and didn't want to spend the additional money to operate properly? Or were there even other reasons, and was it easy to blame on the environmentalists? And the same with the tannery. The tannery operated, it's the oldest operating industry in the county, and they closed, I believe, in, 2002. But, I can't say for sure, but I know sometimes companies close and the environmentalists are blamed for it, or environmental regulations are blamed for it, but it's a business decision, and it may be simply that they were not interested in operating environmentally, and if that's the case, then what do you do? Or it could have closed for some reason that had nothing to do with that, and it gave the appearance of closing for environmental reasons.
In working on these projects, what were your biggest frustrations?
Well, and let me add too that I don't ever want to take away somebody's jobs. I have no problem with companies here offering jobs. I just want and expect them to be a good neighbor. We want the jobs, but do we have to have the pollution? We don't necessarily have to have both. I don't think we have to accept the pollution with the jobs. And what was your question, Deb?
During these times of all these committees and what was going on, what were your biggest frustrations?
Well, I think some of the earliest frustrations were a lot of the myths that were kind of being promoted, especially in the 80s. You know, the 80s were a time of, you know, rolling back regulation, and, you know, I'd go to meetings where, you know, I'd hear a lot of things that were really untrue about our environmental laws and how they were so strict, and, you know, these companies were having to, you know, especially with cleanups, having to clean up to pristine days, and, you know, if you knew anything about it, you knew that wasn't the case. And so I think that was one of my biggest frustrations, and even now when I look back, that was the start of a lot of rolling back of regulations and a lot of active promoting of anti-environmental myths. You know, that environmentalists are out to get your jobs, and they don't care about jobs, and they just care about spotted owls and things like that, and couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, you know, as much as you don't want to stereotype industry, you don't want to stereotype environmentalists. There are, you know, many different people that come under that heading.
It seems to me like a large part of what you've been doing through the years is educating the public on many issues, on what you're out there doing and trying to accomplish. And even today when you're doing your nature walks, you're still trying to educate the public.
Well, you know, maybe I'm just an educator at heart with my background and, you know, my parents as teachers, but, you know, information is so valuable, you know, and I think that, you know, my hope is that once people see, you know, information there, and they're not always in a position to search that information out or do the research. I mean, I'm fortunate enough that this has been my job, you know, so I'm able to put the time into researching the issues and also kind of interpreting it, because often the information is presented in such a way that's hard for a layperson to understand. But the other piece of this is that I fully believe that people have the right to be involved in these decisions. And I think they have the responsibility, you know. So if I can help by providing, you know, the information, and they can make up their own minds, you know. But I want people to be a part of things. I want people to understand that they don't have to be a scientist to participate in these decisions, because I'm not.
What sparked the White Lake Environmental History Project?
Well, I've been involved with the White Lake Public Advisory Council since 1992. I helped to found it, and I was the chair for 9 years. There's been a core group of probably a half a dozen people who've stuck with it, and then the neat thing is people have been in and out of the process in that 20 years, helping when they can, you know, if they have some free time, you know, retired people or people who have some time to give to us. And people have always participated by coming to meetings and writing letters. And, you know, I don't think people realize how important that is. If you have a meeting about an issue and you have one or two people show up, you're showing the media, you're showing politicians that nobody cares about that issue. But by being a person who attends, and you're one of 50 or one of 100, you're sending a message to your elected official and to the media and to other people that this is important. So, you know, those things that seem to be little are not really little. But over the last 20 years, we have been able to make a lot of progress at cleaning up White Lake. It's not perfect. You know, the metaphor that I like to use, I didn't make up myself, is that we can take it out of the general ward in the Hospital of Lakes, and, well, we can take it out of the intensive ward, and then we can put it into the general ward. So we're going to be like other lakes. You know, it needed a special boost, a special cleanup. But, you know, I've become fascinated with what happened here. And, you know, like I mentioned, I was not fully aware of all of the specifics, and certainly some of the things happened when I was a young child. So I'm curious to know more myself. But I also think when I look back on it, it is probably one of the biggest events in our community's history. You know, so to the extent that we can understand it a little better, know the full story, and then also know what's happened as far as the recovery, which I think is a big deal. I think we'll be better off for that.
Were you the one who started the Environmental History Project?
Well, it was my idea. Years ago, I was asked to give a talk to ninth graders when there was going to be a dredging in the lake related to Hooker Chemical, and that's when I realized I really didn't know the specifics. So I went into the vertical file of the White Lake Community Library and I read through all the clippings, and I was just kind of enthralled with the story. And I thought, wow, this is just your classic jobs versus the environment, you know, people with passion on both sides. And I thought someone really should write a book about it. And then shortly after that, I saw a silent movie done by David Ruck, a friend of my nephew's, Nate Hussey. And I asked Nate, I scrounged together some money when I worked at the Federation and said, you know, how about if you do a video on this story, and gave him all kinds of information and contacts, and all of a sudden he went to work, and I think he was quite young, in his early 20s, and then he came back to me and he said, well, hey, Mrs. Cabala, I'm done. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I haven't even looked at it, and what have you done? And so he's quite a go-getter. And so I looked at it. I made a few tweaks just for accuracy, but I was really, really impressed with what he did. It was a tremendous job. And he called it "This is Not a Chocolate Factory," because when Warren Dobson, the Hooker Chemical Company worker that blew the whistle on the company, when he would complain to his bosses about, you know, pollution and what they were doing, they would say to him, well, now, you know, this is not a chocolate factory. You know, so it's a tremendous, well done film, just about 30 minutes. And, you know, but ever since that's been done, I have had a very strong interest in knowing more about our story and telling our story. And a couple years ago, a reporter from the Detroit Free Press was kind of looking into the issue, and he did quite a bit of research, and I said to him, I said, gosh, maybe you should write a book. And he said, well, you should, Tanya. And that just made me think, and I thought, you know what, why not? What's happened is it ended up being, the first stage is this digital resource collection, you know, where we have the oral history interviews, we have materials, and kind of catching the attention of the community. The next stage, hopefully, if we can find additional funding, will be funding to do more oral history interviews, more gathering of information, and then, you know, hopefully the writing of the book, which would actually start even beyond the chemical manufacturing era, go back to, you know, the logging, the Native Americans, and tell the factual story of what happened up through recovery, but also use what we have gotten with people's stories to make it into something that people want to read.
With all the people who have been interviewed and all the different stories that have come out, was there any aha moments during these interviews that really intrigued you?
Well, there were a lot of surprises for me. You know, I remember when I was interviewing the Jane Hanna, Bev Hunt, and Jim Casino from the Blueberry Ridge subdivision, I thought, I never knew that that Brett Hume came here and stayed here for a couple days and then did a big national news story. I didn't really know how they got their drinking water from Hooker Chemical. And, you know, there were just, I certainly didn't know how some of the workers felt about it, because that was always, in some ways, a taboo topic. And so, you know, some of the people who worked at the companies, you know, graciously agreed to be interviewed, and it was very interesting to see their perspective. You know, I didn't realize, for example, that during the Depression, the tannery didn't lay off any people. These were still good jobs for people in the area during a really tough time. And also when, Hooker Chemical came, that, and then DuPont, that it was viewed as a very positive change for the community, and it really changed the community. It brought in people with education, and it kind of increased the diversity somewhat, and both of the schools expanded, and so it's important to know as much as possible about the impact of the companies coming here, and then people can make up their own minds as far as weighing the impact and deciding ultimately if it was good or bad.
So what do you hope this project brings to future residents?
Well, what I'm hoping is that we were put on the map for pollution in the late 70s and early 80s. We were put on the national map. We were a poster child for pollution, and it's just what happened. I'd like us to be back on the map as a poster child for recovery. And I would like this book to lay out that story.
Your company, the Great Lakes Consulting, how do you use your background and your company to move things forward in environmental concerns?
Well, after I worked for the Lake Michigan Federation, I left to set up my own business, so I'm back to one person again, and 2 dogs. And my goal is to look at things I think are necessary to be done, and then find a way to get those things done. For example, this project, the library was, willing to be involved in it, and it was certainly I can't do things by myself, so all of the projects that I work on are collaborative. This I worked on with the library and the White Lake Area Historical Association, the Montague Museum and Historical Association. Different groups were involved with this, and so I guess I see my role as continuing to add something of value to the community, or beyond, but also to make a living. I'm not retired yet, and I still need to make a living, so I need to combine those 2 goals, to do something that I think is valuable to be done, and in the meantime, to do something I love doing, I think is important, and to make a living.
Okay.
Our community should be very proud. We had, granted, we've had a relatively small group of people kind of at the core. And in the past there were, individuals, Lynn Dahlstrom, Marion Dawson, kind of Mary Mahoney, Chuck Vanderlaan, Bob Wesley. There were people who always carried the torch in one way or another, and they carried it in different ways, Wint and I kind of split ways because we had a different approach, but it doesn't make his approach bad. It just means it was his approach and it was valuable at that time. My approach has been different. Jeff Falk and Greg Mund and, people on the White Lake Public Advisory Council. And I think what's really, heartwarming to see is that there's always been someone willing to speak out. And there's people who've been willing to do the work. And you can do it as individuals, but you can also go together as, for example, the White Lake Public Advisory Council, and be that much more effective. And I think we've come a long way, and I think, people in the community deserve a lot of credit. And I think my hope is that the entire community will get the credit it deserves for addressing a really challenging issue and coming out the better for it.
I particularly enjoyed your article in Last Sunday Speakin' about White Lake the Beautiful, the phrase that used to be used all the time and has sort of gone away. And again, you were educating the reader, talking about how the phrase came into being. and how you ended your story with you'd like to see it coming back, and that just certainly goes with everything you've been saying.
Well, when I first heard Norm Allman say that, the stationery on both the cities used to say, "On White Lake the Beautiful," I thought, why don't we say that anymore? I mean, that's certainly how I feel about the lake, White Lake the Beautiful. And the article I wrote actually does kind of mention that the legend that I unearthed in the museum, who knows how much is fact or fantasy. But what was interesting to find out was that we've actually been calling it White Lake the Beautiful since the late 1800s, and I didn't know that. And so absolutely, I want to bring back that motto or that saying, and I think, who knows, the book title might be, Bringing Back White Lake the Beautiful. I think I would love to see that.
Well, personally, I think you should be extremely proud of your efforts to clean up and protect and nurture our beautiful area. I applaud your efforts.
Well, thank you, Deb. Like I said, you're biased, but I'm also aware of all the other people who have done things too. So just glad to be able to do my part.
Tanya, do you have any final comments today?
I think I've probably said enough. I think, mostly just I'm well aware of how fortunate I am to live in this community, and hopefully I can give something back.